At my third job interview that month, the hiring manager looked at me with a strange expression and said quietly, "Before we go any further, there's something I need to ask you about." He turned his laptop screen toward me. On it was an email. My heart stopped. The subject line read, "Urgent. Background information about this applicant." The sender's name made my stomach drop. It was my father. "I'm glad you're here. Stay with me until the end of my story, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from." I always find it amazing how far these stories travel, because what happened to me didn't just ruin my career. For nearly 3 years it destroyed my entire life. And it started with something I didn't even realize was happening. 3 years ago, I was 27 and fresh out of graduate school. I had done everything right. At least that's what I believed at the time. I worked 2 part-time jobs while finishing my degree in business administration. I graduated with good grades. I had internship experience, solid recommendations, and a resume that any entry-level employer should have been happy to see. The first few interviews went well. Too well. Managers smiled. They nodded. They told me things like, "We'll definitely be in touch." One even said, "You're exactly the type of candidate we're looking for." Then the rejection emails started arriving. First I assumed it was normal. The job market is competitive. Everyone says that. But after the 10th rejection, something started to feel wrong. Because the pattern was always the same. The interviews would go great. Then suddenly communication would stop. A few days later, I'd receive a polite email. "After careful consideration, we've decided to move forward with another candidate." No explanation. No feedback. Just silence. I kept trying. Month after month. Application after application. Resume tweaks. Cover letters rewritten a dozen times. Networking events. LinkedIn messages. But nothing worked. And the strangest part? The interviews kept going well. Employers seemed interested. Sometimes even excited. Until suddenly they weren't. By the time I reached my 30th interview, I started questioning myself. Maybe I was saying something wrong. Maybe I seemed arrogant. Maybe my answers sounded rehearsed. Maybe I just wasn't good enough. Doubt has a way of creeping in slowly, like fog rolling over a field. At first you barely notice it. Then suddenly, you can't see anything clearly anymore. That's what those months felt like. Confusing. Disorienting. I began to feel embarrassed when friends asked about my job search. "So, any offers yet?" I'd smile and say something vague. "Still interviewing." My savings started shrinking. Rent. Student loans. Groceries. Gas. Life doesn't pause just because you're struggling. 6 months passed. Then 9. Then a full year. I had applied to over 100 jobs. Nothing. By then, my parents had started calling me more often. Not to ask how I was doing, but to ask when I planned to get serious about life. My father had always believed in tough love. At least that's what he called it. "You're too independent," he once told me. "You should come work at the family business." The family business was a regional construction company he'd run for 30 years. Working there meant living back in my hometown. Under his rules. Under his supervision. I had politely refused. More than once. I wanted to build my own career. At the time, I didn't realize that decision had already made me his enemy. But I would soon learn something much worse. Because during that interview, the one where the hiring manager showed me the email, I finally saw the truth. The manager cleared his throat. "I don't usually bring something like this up," he said carefully. "But we received a warning about you." My throat went dry. A warning. He nodded and scrolled down the email. There it was. Black text on a white screen. Words that made my chest feel hollow. It claimed I had a criminal record. Fraud. Financial misconduct. "Are these accusations true?" he asked gently. For a moment I couldn't speak. My mind raced. I had never even gotten a parking ticket. Finally I managed to say, "No, that's not true. None of it." The manager looked uncomfortable. "I believe you," he said. "But when something like this appears during hiring, it becomes complicated." He paused before adding quietly, "And the person who sent the email insisted we verify it." I already knew the answer. But I asked anyway. "Who sent it?" He turned the laptop slightly closer to me. And there it was. My father's name. That was the moment I realized something that would take me years to fully understand. I wasn't failing to get hired because of bad luck. I wasn't failing because I lacked experience. I wasn't failing because the job market was competitive. I was failing because someone was making sure I never succeeded. And the person destroying my future was my own father. I walked out of that interview building in a daze. The glass doors closed behind me with a soft click, but the sound echoed in my head like something much louder. For a few seconds I just stood there on the sidewalk, staring at the reflection of the city in the building's windows. Cars passed. People walked by. Someone nearby was laughing into a phone. The world kept moving like nothing had happened, but my entire reality had just shifted. My father. The hiring manager had shown me the email twice before I left, almost apologetically, like he wanted me to understand that he wasn't accusing me of anything. Still, the words were burned into my mind. I believe you deserve to know the truth about this applicant. My child has a criminal history and a pattern of dishonest behavior. Please verify before trusting them with financial responsibility. It wasn't just a warning. It was written carefully, deliberately, like something meant to sound credible. And it worked. Because once a company hears the words criminal record, the conversation is already over. I sat down on a bench across the street and pulled out my phone. My hands were shaking. For a long moment I just stared at my father's name in the email screenshot I had taken. Part of me still wanted to believe there had been some kind of misunderstanding. Maybe someone had hacked his email. Maybe it was a joke. Maybe. But deep down I already knew the truth. The hiring manager had said something else before I left. Something I couldn't stop thinking about. He had said carefully, "This isn't the first time we've received a message like this." At the time I hadn't asked what he meant. Now I wished I had. Because suddenly the past 3 years started rearranging themselves in my mind, like puzzle pieces finally clicking into place. The sudden silence after interviews. The polite rejection emails. The awkward pauses when hiring managers looked at my resume. One moment in particular came back to me. It had happened almost a year earlier. I had interviewed with a mid-sized marketing firm downtown. The meeting had gone great. The director even walked me to the elevator afterward and said, "You'll be hearing from us very soon." 2 days later she called. Her voice sounded different. Careful. Almost distant. "We've decided to move in another direction," she said. I remember asking a little too quickly, "Did I do something wrong in the interview?" There was a pause. Then she said something that confused me at the time. "No. It's just that some additional information came to light." I had spent weeks wondering what that meant. Now I understood. Another memory surfaced. A tech startup I interviewed with during my second year of job hunting. The CEO had been enthusiastic. He talked about long-term growth, leadership opportunities, even future promotions. 3 days later he sent a short email. "After reviewing your background further, we cannot proceed." At the time I assumed the background check had revealed something. But there was nothing to reveal. No arrests. No charges. No disciplinary records. Just a normal life. Except now I knew that every time a company tried to verify my background, someone else was speaking first. And that someone was my father. The realization made my chest feel tight. Because this wasn't a single mistake. This was a pattern. And patterns take effort. I opened my call history and stared at my father's contact name. For a few seconds I thought about calling him immediately, demanding an explanation. But another memory stopped me. About 8 months earlier, during Thanksgiving dinner, my father had leaned back in his chair and said something that felt strange at the time. "You're still job hunting, huh?" I nodded. "Yeah. Interviews are going well. Something will land soon." He had smiled in a way that now made my stomach turn. "You know," he said, cutting his turkey slowly, "life would be a lot easier if you stopped being so stubborn." My mother stayed quiet. She always did during moments like that. I remember replying carefully, "I just want to build my own career." My father laughed softly. "Everyone eventually learns they can't do everything on their own." At the time I thought it was just another lecture. Now I realized it had been something else. A warning. I looked down at my phone again. The thought slowly formed in my mind. If my father had contacted this company, how many others had he called? 10? 20? All of them? Suddenly the 3 years of rejection didn't feel random anymore. They felt orchestrated, planned, controlled. I stood up from the bench and started walking without thinking, the cold air hitting my face as the truth settled in. Someone hadn't just sabotaged a few job opportunities. Someone had systematically destroyed every chance I had to build a future. And the worst part? This meant the last 3 years of my life had never really been mine to begin with. They had been carefully dismantled, one phone call at a time. And I still had no idea how far my father had gone to make sure I failed. I didn't call my father that day. I thought about it more than once. But something told me that if I called him while I was still angry, I wouldn't get the truth. I would just get one of his lectures. The same calm, controlled tone he always used whenever he believed he was teaching me a lesson. So instead I went home. My apartment was small. A one-bedroom place on the 3rd floor of an aging building with thin walls, and a radiator that knocked loudly every winter. It wasn't impressive, but it had always felt like proof that I was building a life on my own terms. That evening it felt different. Quieter. I dropped my bag on the kitchen chair and opened my laptop. If my father had really contacted multiple companies, there had to be evidence somewhere. Emails. Messages. Something. I opened my inbox and started scrolling through the rejection emails I'd saved over the past 3 years. First they all looked the same. Polite. Carefully worded. Corporate language designed to say nothing. Thank you for your interest. We have decided to move forward with another candidate. We wish you the best in your continued search. But the more I looked at them, the more I started noticing small differences. Some emails had arrived within hours of my interviews ending. That didn't make sense. Most companies take days to decide. Some emails mentioned additional information discovered during review. Others referenced background concerns. I leaned back in my chair and rubbed my eyes. 3 years. 3 years of interviews. 3 years of confusion. 3 years of slowly draining savings. And suddenly it all felt like someone had been pulling strings behind a curtain the entire time. I opened another email from a company I'd interviewed with about 6 months earlier. The hiring manager had been friendly. We talked for nearly an hour. At the end she said, "You seem like a great fit here." 2 days later she sent a message. It included one line that stood out now more than ever. Due to concerns raised during our background review process, we cannot proceed. Background review. Except I knew there was nothing in my background to review, which meant the information must have come from somewhere else. Or someone else. I stared at the screen for a long time. Then I did something I should have done years earlier. I typed my own name into a background check website. The results came back instantly. Clean. No records. No charges. No investigations. Nothing. Exactly what I expected. Which meant every company that rejected me had been acting on information that didn't exist. Information that someone had provided directly. The thought made my stomach twist. Because if my father had really contacted those companies, that meant he had been actively working to destroy every opportunity one found. And that required effort. Phone calls. Emails. Time. Planning. No one does that by accident. My phone buzzed suddenly on the table. The sound startled me. I glanced down. It was a text message. From my father. For a moment I just stared at the screen. We hadn't spoken in weeks. The message was short. Just one line. "How's the job search going?" I felt a strange chill run through me, because now that I knew what he had been doing behind my back, that question sounded completely different. It didn't sound curious. It sounded amused. I didn't reply. Instead, I set the phone face down on the table. A few seconds later it buzzed again. Another message. Still nothing yet? I could almost hear his voice in my head. That same calm tone. That same quiet confidence. Like someone watching a game they already knew the outcome of. My hands tightened around the edge of the table. For years I had blamed myself. I thought I wasn't good enough. Not experienced enough. Not impressive enough. But now the truth was sitting right in front of me. Every opportunity one found had been quietly erased. Every door I knocked on had been closed before I could even step through it. And the person holding those doors shut was my own father. The third message arrived a few minutes later. This one was longer. "You know you could solve all of this if you just came home." I stared at the words. My chest felt tight, because suddenly I understood something that made everything worse. This wasn't just sabotage. This was leverage. He wasn't trying to ruin my life for no reason. He was trying to force me back under his control. The final message arrived a minute later. Come home and apologize. Then another line appeared beneath it. And maybe I'll stop making those calls. I read the message 3 times, each time hoping I had misunderstood it. But the meaning was clear. For 3 years, my father had been quietly destroying every job opportunity one found. And now he was offering to stop. Not because it was wrong, but because he wanted something in return. An apology. And my surrender. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the ceiling. For the first time since that interview earlier that day, I felt something stronger than confusion. Stronger than anger. It was clarity. Because now I knew exactly what my father had been doing. What I didn't know yet was how far he had gone to make sure I never escaped him. I didn't reply to my father's messages that night. Not because I didn't have anything to say, but because suddenly I understood something about him that I hadn't fully accepted before. My father didn't want a conversation. He wanted control. And the moment I responded, the conversation would turn into the same argument we'd been having for years. The argument about my life. I grew up in a small town about 2 hours outside the city where I now lived. My father owned a construction company there. A business he built from nothing in his early 30s. People in town respected him. Feared him too. He was the kind of man who believed hard work solved everything. The kind who said things like, people who fail are just people who quit too early. When I was younger, I admired him. He worked long hours. He provided for our family. He expected discipline. But as I got older, I started noticing something else. Everything in our house revolved around his expectations. Dinner conversations were about the company. Weekends were about job sites. Even vacations somehow turned into discussions about future expansion. And from the time I was a teenager, my father spoke about my future as if it had already been decided. You'll run the business one day, he used to say. Not maybe. Not if you want to. Just when. First, I didn't question it. Most kids don't question the plans their parents make for them. But something changed when I went to college. Living away from home for the first time gave me a different perspective. I discovered I liked studying business theory, marketing strategies, corporate development, things that had nothing to do with pouring concrete or managing construction crews. I realized there were entire industries my father had never considered. And for the first time in my life, I started imagining a future that wasn't already mapped out for me. The first time I told my father I didn't want to join the company, I was 22. I still remember the silence that followed. We were sitting at the kitchen table. My mother was washing dishes. My father just stared at me for a long moment. Then he said something that stuck with me. You'll change your mind. Not angry. Not even surprised. Just confident. Like someone who already knew how the story would end. But I didn't change my mind. After graduating, I moved to the city and started building my own career. At first, my father acted supportive. He called occasionally, asked about work, told his friends his child was working in business. But the tone slowly changed, especially when I turned down his offers to return home. The first time he suggested it, I laughed it off. Maybe someday, I said. The second time he sounded more serious. You could start as operations manager, he told me. Learn the numbers side of the company. I thanked him but said I wanted to stay in the city. The third time he asked, the conversation ended differently. You're wasting time, he said. I'm building something that will last for generations, and you're chasing office jobs. I tried to keep the conversation calm. It's just a different path. But my father didn't believe in different paths. He believed in the right path. His path. After that conversation, things between us became tense. Phone calls grew shorter. Visits home became uncomfortable. My father would ask questions about my career with a tone that sounded less like curiosity and more like evaluation. How much are you making now? What exactly do you do all day? Do you actually see a future in that? Each question felt like a test. And each answer seemed to disappoint him more. The last major argument we had happened about 3 years ago, right before my job search started. At the time, I thought it was just another family disagreement. Now I realized it had probably been something much bigger. I had gone home for my mother's birthday. Dinner started normally. Cake, small talk, stories about neighbors. Then my father asked a question that changed everything. "So when are you coming back to run the company?" I remember putting my fork down. "I'm not." The word hung in the air. My mother stopped cutting the cake. My father leaned back in his chair. "You're serious?" "Yes." I tried to explain. I talked about the career I wanted, the opportunities in the city, the future I was building. But my father wasn't listening anymore. He just looked at me with a calm expression I had seen many times before. The expression he used when someone on a job site made a mistake. "You're making a bad decision," he said. "I don't think I am." He nodded slowly. Then he said something I didn't fully understand at the time. "Eventually you'll realize how much you need this family." The conversation ended shortly after that. I drove back to the city that night feeling frustrated, but also strangely relieved. I thought we had simply reached an impasse. Parents and adult children disagree sometimes. That's normal. At least that's what I told myself. Now, sitting alone in my apartment 3 years later, staring at the messages on my phone, I realized something that made my stomach drop. My father hadn't accepted my decision. He hadn't moved on. Instead, he had been quietly waiting for the moment when I would have no choice but to come back. And for the past 3 years, he had been making sure that moment arrived. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, my father's message replayed in my head. "Come home and apologize. And maybe I'll stop making those calls." The words felt less like a message and more like a contract. A simple trade. My independence for my future. And the worst part was realizing how effective his plan had been. Because by that point my savings were already running dangerously low. 3 years of job hunting had slowly drained everything I had built. Rent, groceries, transportation, student loan payments. Life in the city wasn't cheap, and without stable income, every month felt like walking across thinner and thinner ice. I checked my bank account the next morning while drinking coffee at my kitchen counter. The number on the screen made my stomach sink. I had maybe 2 months left. 3 if I cut back on everything. Which meant my father knew exactly what he was doing. He wasn't just sabotaging my career. He was waiting for the moment when I would run out of options. When pride would finally give way to desperation. When I would call him and say the one thing he wanted to hear. "You were right." That realization changed something in me. For years I had been confused. For years I had blamed myself. But now the situation was painfully clear. My father had built a trap. And I had been walking deeper into it every time I applied for another job. I opened my laptop again that morning and started doing something different. Instead of applying for new positions, I started looking backward. I searched through old email threads, saved interview confirmations, follow-up messages. Every company I had spoken to over the past 3 years. The list was longer than I expected. More than 60 interviews. Some in person. Some over video calls. Some that had progressed to second or third rounds. Every single one had ended the same way. Sudden silence. Then rejection. At first the pattern had felt like bad luck. Now it looked like sabotage. Around noon I decided to test something. I found the contact information for one of the hiring managers I had interviewed with about 4 months earlier. Her name was Melissa. The interview with her company had been one of the strangest ones. She had seemed excited about my background. But halfway through the second round interview, her attitude had subtly shifted. The meeting ended politely, but colder than it began. 2 days later I received another rejection email. At the time I assumed I had said something wrong. Now I wondered if something else had happened behind the scenes. My finger hovered over the keyboard for a long moment. Then I typed a short message. "Hi Melissa, I hope you're doing well. I had a quick question regarding my application earlier this year. I recently discovered something concerning about false information being shared about me during hiring processes, and I wanted to ask if your company may have received anything like that." I stared at the email for a few seconds before hitting send. Then I waited. The response came sooner than I expected. About 20 minutes later my inbox chimed. Melissa's reply was short, but it made my heart race. "Yes, actually. We did receive something unusual during your hiring process. I leaned closer to the screen. She continued. Someone claiming to be a family member contacted our office and warned us about hiring you. They said you had a criminal record involving financial fraud. My chest tightened. Even though I already knew the answer, I typed the question anyway. Did they say who they were? Her reply came a few minutes later. Yes. They said they were your father. I closed my eyes for a moment. Hearing confirmation from someone outside my own thoughts made everything feel heavier. Real. But Melissa's message wasn't finished. There was one more paragraph. To be honest, the situation felt strange at the time. The caller sounded very determined to make sure we didn't hire you. It made the hiring team uncomfortable. Uncomfortable. That word stayed with me. Because my father wasn't just making casual comments. He was actively convincing employers that I was dangerous to hire. I leaned back in my chair again, staring at the ceiling. One company confirmed, which meant there were probably dozens more. I thought back to the message he sent the night before. And maybe I'll stop making those calls. Not a call. Calls. Plural. Which meant the sabotage hadn't stopped. It was ongoing. Every time I applied somewhere new, my father might already be working behind the scenes. And suddenly another thought hit me. Something worse. If he had been calling companies for 3 years, how many other parts of my life had he been interfering with? Friends, professional connections, networking opportunities. I had assumed my struggle was limited to job applications. But what if the damage went further than that? I picked up my phone again and stared at his contact name. For the first time since discovering the truth, I considered calling him. Not to argue, not to apologize, but to ask one question. A simple one. How far did you go? But before I could decide whether to press call, another message appeared on my phone screen. It wasn't from my father. It was from a number I didn't recognize. The message was short. Just one sentence. I believe you're the person I've been looking for. Then a second message arrived. Your grandmother hired me 10 years ago to find you if things ever got bad enough. I stared at the screen. My grandmother had passed away 8 years earlier. And for a moment nothing about the message made sense. Then the third message appeared. I think that time has finally come. I stared at the phone screen for a long time. The message didn't make sense. My grandmother had passed away 8 years ago. She had been the quietest person in our family. Gentle. Soft-spoken. The kind of person who never raised her voice even when my father did. She baked pies on Sunday afternoons. She kept old photo albums in the living room cabinet. She used to slip $20 bills into my hand when I visited, whispering, "Don't tell your father." Hiring someone to find me if things got bad enough didn't sound like something she would do. And yet the message sat there on my phone. I read it again. Your grandmother hired me 10 years ago to find you if things ever got bad enough. 10 years ago. That would have been when I was still in college. Before the arguments with my father became serious. Before the job search. Before everything started falling apart. I typed a reply slowly. Who is this? The response came almost immediately. My name is Linda Carter. I'm a private investigator. I blinked. A private investigator. That explained the strange tone of the message, but it raised even more questions. Why would my grandmother hire a private investigator? And why would that investigator contact me now? Another message appeared. Your grandmother paid me to keep track of you and to step in if your parents ever tried to interfere with your life. My chest tightened. I read the line twice. Then a third time. Because suddenly something from years ago resurfaced in my memory. A conversation I had almost forgotten. It happened the summer before my grandmother passed away. We were sitting on the back porch of her house. The evening air smelled like freshly cut grass, and the sun was setting behind the trees across the road. She had been watching me quietly for a long time. Then she asked a question that seemed strange at the time. Are you happy living in the city? I told her yes. I talked about school, my friends, my plans for the future. She nodded slowly. Then she said something I didn't understand back then. Your father has a very strong idea of what family should be. I remember laughing a little. That's one way to put it. She didn't laugh. Instead, she reached over and squeezed my hand. Sometimes strong ideas become controlling ones. At the time, I thought she was just worrying. Grandparents worry about things. But now, sitting alone in my apartment years later, I realized she might have been trying to warn me. My phone buzzed again. Another message from Linda Carter. Your grandmother left something for you. She asked me to deliver it if the situation with your parents ever escalated. I felt my pulse quicken. What situation? I typed back. Her answer came a moment later. She believed your father would eventually try to force you back into the family business. That sentence made the room feel strangely quiet, because that was exactly what had been happening. Linda continued typing. The next message was longer. Your grandmother knew your father well. She told me he doesn't accept losing control easily. She worried that if you refused to return home, he might try to sabotage your independence. Sabotage. The word felt heavy. And suddenly my grandmother's quiet warnings from years ago made a lot more sense. I leaned back in my chair trying to process everything. For 3 years I had been struggling to understand why my life kept collapsing in small confusing ways. Now 2 different truths had appeared almost at the same time. My father had been destroying my job opportunities, and somehow my grandmother had predicted something like this might happen. My phone buzzed again. Another message from Linda. I think we should meet. I hesitated before replying. Meeting a stranger who claimed to have been hired by my grandmother sounded surreal. But at the same time, it might be the only chance I had to understand what was really happening. I typed a short reply. What exactly did she leave me? The typing dots appeared on the screen again. Then the answer came. A box. Just one word. A box. I frowned at the screen. That's it. I typed. Linda replied a few seconds later. It contains documents your grandmother collected over many years. My stomach tightened. Documents. Evidence. Something about that word made my mind race. Because if my grandmother had been worried about my father, what exactly had she been collecting? Before I could ask another question, Linda sent one more message. Your grandmother asked me to give it to you only when you were ready to see the truth about your family. I read the sentence slowly. Ready to see the truth. For most of my life I believed I understood my family. My father was strict. My mother avoided conflict. My grandmother was quiet but kind. That was the story I had always told myself. But now it felt like there was an entire second story hiding underneath the first one. A story my grandmother had apparently been preparing me to discover. My phone buzzed one more time. Linda sent an address. A small cafe on the edge of downtown. Then one final message appeared beneath it. Bring an open mind, she wrote. Because what's inside that box is going to change how you see your parents forever. The cafe Linda sent me was about 20 minutes from my apartment. I almost didn't go. For most of the afternoon I sat at my kitchen table staring at the address on my phone, wondering if the whole thing was some kind of mistake. Or worse, some kind of scam. A stranger claiming my grandmother had hired them. A mysterious box filled with documents. It sounded like the beginning of a movie, not something that actually happens in real life. But then I remembered the message from my father the night before. Come home and apologize. Maybe I'll stop making those calls. That message alone told me something was deeply wrong. And if my grandmother really had been preparing for this situation, I needed to know why. So the next morning I drove downtown. The cafe Linda chose was small and quiet. One of those places tucked between 2 larger buildings where people mostly came to read or work on laptops. When I walked in, the smell of coffee and toasted bread filled the room. Only a few tables were occupied. A woman sitting near the window raised her hand slightly when she saw me looking around. She looked to be in her late 50s. Short gray hair. Dark blazer. The kind of calm posture that made her look like someone who spent a lot of time observing people. I walked over slowly. Linda? I asked. She nodded. And you must be the person your grandmother was worried about. Something about the way she said it made me sit down without another word. For a moment neither of us spoke. Then she reached down beside her chair and placed a small wooden box on the table. It wasn't very big. Maybe the size of a thick book. Dark wood. Simple latch. The kind of box you might keep old letters in. My chest tightened a little. That's it. I asked quietly. Linda nodded. Your grandmother gave this to me 10 years ago. She pushed the box slightly toward me. I was instructed to hold on to it until you needed it. I rested my hand on the lid but didn't open it yet. Instead I looked at her. I still don't understand something, I said. Why would my grandmother hire a private investigator? Linda leaned back slightly. She was worried. About what? About your father. The answer came so simply that it made my stomach tighten. Linda continued calmly. I met your grandmother several times before she passed away. She was a very thoughtful woman. I nodded. That sounds like her. Linda gave a small smile. Yes. But she was also very observant. She folded her hands on the table. She told me something during our second meeting that I've never forgotten. I waited. Linda continued. She said your father believes love and control are the same thing. The words landed quietly between us. But they hit harder than I expected. Because deep down, I knew exactly what she meant. Linda glanced at the box again. She hired me because she believed that one day you might need proof of what your father was capable of. Proof. The word echoed in my mind. For what? I asked. Linda's expression didn't change. For protecting yourself. A quiet silence filled the space between us. The cafe espresso machine hissed somewhere behind the counter. Someone laughed softly at another table. But everything at our table suddenly felt heavy. Did she think my father would actually hurt me? I asked. Linda shook her head slowly. Not physically. Then she added something that made my chest tighten. But she believed he might try to control your life in other ways. Other ways. Like destroying my career. Like sabotaging every opportunity one found. I looked down at the wooden box again. My fingers rested on the lid. What's inside? I asked. Linda answered without hesitation. Evidence. The word made my heart beat a little faster. Evidence of what? Linda watched me carefully for a moment before replying. Your grandmother believed that if your father ever tried to manipulate your future, you would need the truth about how far he was willing to go. I exhaled slowly. For years I had assumed my struggle to find work was bad luck. Then yesterday I discovered my father had been sabotaging my job applications. And now someone was telling me my grandmother had been preparing evidence against him for a decade. The story felt almost impossible. But the wooden box sitting in front of me was real. I lifted the lid slowly. Inside were several envelopes, a small stack of documents, and one thick folder. Everything was neatly organized. My grandmother had always been very organized. On top of the stack sat a single handwritten letter. My grandmother's handwriting. I recognized it immediately. The neat loops. The careful spacing. My throat tightened a little. I picked up the letter but didn't open it yet. Instead I looked back at Linda. How long have you been waiting to give this to me? She didn't hesitate. 10 years. 10 years. That meant my grandmother had started preparing this long before any of the problems with my father had become obvious. Which meant she had seen something I hadn't. Something that took me years to understand. Linda nodded toward the box. You should read the letter first. I looked down at the envelope again. My name was written across the front. Just one word. Nothing else. For a moment my hands didn't move. Because suddenly I had the strange feeling that whatever was inside that letter was about to explain everything. And once I read it, there would be no going back to the version of my family I used to believe in. For a moment, I just stared at the envelope. My grandmother's handwriting was unmistakable, neat, careful, patient. She had always written like someone who believed words mattered. My name sat alone on the front of the envelope. No date, no explanation, just my name. I slid my finger under the flap and opened it slowly. The paper inside was folded twice. When I unfolded it, the first line immediately made my chest tighten. If you are reading this, something has gone very wrong. I exhaled quietly and kept reading. Her handwriting filled the page in steady lines. I hope this letter reaches you only if you truly need it. But if it does, then I'm afraid your father has done exactly what I feared he might do. I stopped reading for a moment. Across the table, Linda watched me silently. She didn't interrupt. She didn't ask questions. She just waited. I looked back down at the letter. Your father has always believed that family means obedience. He does not understand the difference between guiding someone and controlling them. That sentence felt painfully accurate. My grandmother continued. For most of his life he has solved problems by forcing the outcome he wants. It worked for him in business. It worked for him with employees. But family does not work the same way. I swallowed and read the next paragraph. I believe that one day you may choose a life your father does not approve of. When that happens, he may try to force you back into the role he has already chosen for you. My mind flashed back to my father's message. Come home and apologize. Maybe I'll stop making those calls. The letter continued. If that day ever comes, you must understand something very clearly. Your father will not see what he is doing as wrong. That line made me pause, because it explained something that had been confusing me since yesterday. My father wasn't hiding what he did. He admitted it openly, like it was justified, like it was simply the natural consequence of my disobedience. I kept reading. That is why I asked Linda to collect certain records over the years. I hoped I would never need them, but if you are reading this, then they may help you protect yourself. My fingers tightened slightly around the paper. Protect myself. I glanced at the box again, at the envelopes, at the thick folder sitting beneath them. Those are the records she mentioned, Linda said quietly. I nodded slowly. Then I looked back at the letter. The next lines made my chest feel strangely heavy. You must also understand something else. Your father was not always like this. That sentence surprised me. I read it again. When he was young, he worked very hard to escape the life he grew up in. He promised himself he would never feel powerless again. I remembered the stories my father used to tell about his childhood. How poor his family had been. How many jobs he worked before starting the construction company. My grandmother continued. The problem is that once he gained control over his life, he never learned how to let anyone else have control over theirs. I leaned back slightly in my chair. The cafe suddenly felt very quiet. Linda watched me carefully. Your grandmother spent years trying to keep peace in your family, she said softly. I can believe that, I replied. But she also believed there might come a day when peace wouldn't be possible anymore. I looked back at the letter again. There were only a few lines left. If the situation has reached the point where you are reading this letter, I want you to remember something important. I felt my throat tighten slightly. You are not responsible for fixing your father. The sentence sat there quietly on the page, but it felt like something I had needed to hear for a long time. I finished the final lines. Everything you need to understand the truth is inside this box. Use it wisely. And remember that choosing your own life is not betrayal. It is freedom. The letter ended simply. Love, Grandma. I folded the paper carefully and set it down on the table. For a moment I didn't say anything. Because the letter didn't just explain my father. It explained the last 3 years of my life. He didn't think he was destroying my future. He thought he was correcting it. I looked at the box again. Your grandmother asked me to collect information quietly over the years, Linda said. I nodded toward the folder. What kind of information? Linda's answer came calmly. Evidence of the ways your father manipulates people. That word again. Evidence. I reached into the box and picked up the thick folder. The paper inside felt heavier than normal documents. Maybe because I already knew what it might contain. Records. Phone logs. Messages. Proof. Proof that what my father had been doing wasn't just strict parenting. It was something else. Something deliberate. I opened the folder slowly. The first document inside made my heart skip. It was a printed email. Dated almost 3 years earlier. Sent to a company I had applied to during the first month of my job search. The sender's name appeared clearly at the top of the page. My father. I turned the page. Another email. Another company. Another warning about my criminal history. My stomach tightened. I flipped through a few more pages. There were dozens. Maybe more. Emails. Call logs. Records of phone conversations. Every single one connected to job applications I had submitted over the past 3 years. My grandmother hadn't just suspected my father might interfere with my life. She had been preparing evidence long before I ever realized what was happening. And as I looked through those documents, one thought slowly formed in my mind. For the past 3 years, my father hadn't just been sabotaging my career. He had been running a campaign against me. And now, sitting in that quiet cafe, I was finally holding the proof. For a while, I just kept turning the pages. Each document inside the folder looked almost the same. a printed email, a call log, sometimes a short report written by Linda. At first it was overwhelming, not because the documents were complicated, but because there were so many of them. Page after page showed the same pattern repeating. My father contacting companies, my father warning them about me, my father insisting that hiring me would be a mistake. Some of the emails were polite, carefully written, almost professional. I believe you deserve to know the truth about this applicant. Others were shorter, blunter. You may want to run a deeper background check before trusting this person. Every time the accusation was the same: fraud, financial misconduct, a criminal past that didn't exist. I flipped through another section of the folder. This one contained phone records. Linda had highlighted several entries. Each one matched the dates of interviews I had attended. A call from my father's number. Then, shortly afterward, a rejection email from the company. The timeline was impossible to ignore. Interview. Call. Rejection. Interview. Call. Rejection. Over and over again. Across the table, Linda spoke. Quietly. Your grandmother asked me to start documenting things the moment you moved to the city. I looked up. Why that moment? Because that's when your father realized he couldn't control your future anymore. I glanced back down at the documents. That explanation made painful sense. 4 years I had thought the turning point in my relationship with my father was the argument about the family business. But according to this folder, the turning point had happened much earlier. The moment I chose independence. I turned another page. This one wasn't an email. It was a short report written by Linda. The heading read, Behavioral Pattern Subject, Father. I frowned slightly. Linda noticed. She asked me to observe certain things, she explained. What things? The way your father reacts when he loses control. The words felt uncomfortably accurate. Linda continued. Your grandmother believed your father doesn't see control the same way most people do. I waited. He sees it as responsibility. Responsibility. That word sounded familiar. My father had used it many times while I was growing up. It's my responsibility to guide this family. It's my responsibility to make sure everyone stays on the right path. Back then, those sentences sounded reasonable. Now they felt different. Because the evidence in front of me showed what happened when someone refused to follow the path he had chosen. Linda tapped the edge of the folder. There's something else you should see. I turned to the final section. This part looked newer than the rest. The documents were more recent. Some of them were dated only a few months ago. The first page contained a short transcript. A phone conversation. My father's voice had been recorded by one of the companies he contacted. I read the line slowly. I'm calling as a concerned parent. My child has a history of dishonesty. I would hate for your company to suffer because of it. The words felt strange on the page. Cold. Calculated. Like someone performing a role. But what really caught my attention was the final line of the transcript. The hiring manager had asked him a question. If this information is true, why hasn't it appeared on a background check? My father's response was printed underneath. Some things disappear from official records. That doesn't mean they didn't happen. I closed my eyes for a moment, because I could hear his voice, perfectly in my head. Calm, confident, completely certain that he was doing the right thing. I set the paper back down. How many companies did he contact? I asked quietly. Linda didn't answer immediately. She opened a small notebook beside the folder. Then she turned it toward me. Inside was a list. Dozens of company names. Some I recognized immediately. Others I had forgotten about. Each one had a small check mark next to it. That list contains every employer I was able to confirm, Linda said. My throat felt dry. How many? 32. 32. I leaned back in my chair slowly. 32 companies. 32 opportunities. 32 doors that had closed before I even realized someone was standing behind me. And those were only the ones Linda had confirmed, which meant there could have been more. I looked down at the folder again. For 3 years I had believed I was unlucky, or inexperienced, or simply not good enough. But the truth sitting in front of me was far worse. My father hadn't just interfered once or twice. He had systematically destroyed every chance I had to build a life outside his control. And he had done it with patience, precision, consistency, like someone managing a long-term project. The realization made my chest feel strangely heavy. I looked up at Linda again. What am I supposed to do with all of this? She didn't hesitate. That depends on what you want. What do you mean? Linda folded her hands calmly on the table. You could confront him. I imagined that conversation. My father sitting across from me, explaining that everything he did was for my own good, that he was protecting the family, that I had forced his hand. I already knew how that conversation would end. Linda continued. Or, she said quietly, you could make sure he never has the power to do this to you again. I looked down at the folder once more. The emails, the call logs, the transcripts. All of it was proof. Proof that what my father had done wasn't just strict parenting. It was defamation, sabotage, something that could destroy a person's life. And suddenly I realized something else. For the first time in 3 years, I wasn't powerless anymore. Because now I had something my father didn't expect me to have. The truth. And the proof to back it up. Left the cafe with the folder in my backpack. The late afternoon air outside felt colder than before. Or maybe it just felt that way because my mind was still processing everything I had just seen. 3 years. 32 companies. Dozens of emails. All of it carefully documented. For the first time since my job search began, the story finally made sense. And for the first time, I had something my father couldn't dismiss. Proof. I drove home slowly. The city traffic moved around me, people heading home from work, stopping at lights, talking on phones. Normal life. The kind of life I had been trying to build for the past 3 years. The kind of life my father had quietly been dismantling. When I got back to my apartment, the place felt smaller than usual. My kitchen table was still covered with my laptop and a stack of printed resumes I had been sending out all week. I sat down and opened the folder again. One by one, I laid the documents across the table. Emails, phone transcripts, Linda's reports. Every piece of paper told the same story. My father contacting employers. My father warning them about me. My father making sure I never got hired. At the bottom of the stack sat the small notebook Linda had shown me earlier. The one listing the 32 companies. I stared at the names again. Some of them I remembered clearly. Others I barely recognized anymore. But each one represented something important. An opportunity. A moment when my life might have gone in a completely different direction. And every one of those moments had been erased. Not by chance. Not by bad luck. But by someone who believed he had the right to decide my future. I leaned back in my chair and looked at the ceiling. For years I had imagined the moment when I would finally succeed. The first real job. The first promotion. The moment I could prove to my father that I didn't need the family business to build a life. Now I realized something strange. I didn't feel the urge to prove anything anymore. I just wanted my life back. My phone buzzed on the table. I glanced down. Another message from my father. The timing almost made me laugh. Have you thought about what I said? I didn't respond. A few seconds later another message appeared. There's still time to come home. I stared at the screen. For years those messages would have filled me with frustration, anger, confusion. Now they felt different. Because I understood the game he had been playing. He thought I had no options left. No job. No money. No support. Which meant he believed the ending of this story was already decided. But there was something he didn't know. Something he couldn't see from 2 hours away in his comfortable office. The folder sitting on my kitchen table. The evidence inside it. And the fact that someone else had been watching him this entire time. I opened my laptop and started searching. Not for jobs. For something else. Legal information. Specifically, cases involving defamation, employment interference, fraudulent accusations. The more I read, the clearer the situation became. What my father had been doing wasn't just unethical. It was illegal. Making false claims about someone having a criminal record. Contacting employers to sabotage job opportunities. Creating financial harm through deliberate misinformation. Every article I read used similar words. Defamation. Tortious interference. Civil liability. I didn't know much about law, but I knew enough to understand one thing. If the evidence in that folder was accurate, my father had crossed a line. A very serious one. My phone buzzed again. Another message. You can't keep pretending you don't need us. I set the phone face down on the table. For a moment I imagined what he thought was happening right now. Maybe he pictured me sitting alone in my apartment. Frustrated. Desperate. Slowly realizing that my independence had been a mistake. Maybe he imagined that eventually I would call him, apologize, agree to come home, accept the job he had been offering all along. But the reality was very different. Because while he believed I was running out of options, I was discovering something else entirely. I opened the notebook again and looked at the list of companies. 32 names. 32 witnesses. 32 businesses that had received false accusations about me, which meant 32 people who might be willing to confirm what had happened. And suddenly the situation looked completely different. For 3 years my father had been the one controlling the story. Now the story had evidence. And evidence has a way of changing everything. I closed the laptop slowly and looked around my quiet apartment. The radiator knocked softly in the corner. A car passed outside. Somewhere in the building upstairs someone was playing music. Normal sounds. Normal life. For the first time in a long time, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Not anger. Not fear. Something calmer. Clarity. Because now I understood something my father had never expected me to understand. Control only works when the other person has no way to fight back. And after 3 years of silence, I finally had the one thing he never thought I would get. A way to fight back. The next morning I made a phone call. Not to my father. To a lawyer. Felt strange even dialing the number. I had never needed a lawyer before. Most of my problems in life had been the kind people solved with conversations, compromises, or simply moving on. But this wasn't that kind of situation anymore. When the receptionist answered, my voice felt steadier than I expected. I'd like to schedule a consultation, I said. She asked a few basic questions, then gave me an appointment later that afternoon. I spent the hours before that meeting organizing everything. Every document from the folder. Every email Linda had collected. Every call log. I even printed copies of the messages my father had sent me the night before. Especially the one that said, "Come home and apologize. Maybe I'll stop making those calls." That sentence alone told a story. By the time I arrived at the lawyer's office, my backpack felt heavier than usual. Not physically. Emotionally. The office was quiet and professional, the kind of place with thick carpets and framed degrees on the walls. The attorney who met me introduced herself as Rachel Kim. She looked through the documents slowly, carefully, page by page. She didn't interrupt much while reading. Occasionally she underlined something with a pen or asked a short question. How long has this been happening? About 3 years. And these are confirmed communications from your father? Yes. She nodded slightly and kept reading. About 20 minutes passed before she leaned back in her chair. Her expression had changed. Not shocked, but serious. Your situation is unusual, she said. That's one way to describe it. She tapped the folder lightly. If these documents are accurate, your father has engaged in repeated defamation and intentional interference with your employment. The legal terms sounded heavy, but the meaning was simple. He had sabotaged my career. Deliberately. And the messages he sent you yesterday? She asked. I handed her my phone. She read them carefully. Then she nodded again. That message is extremely important. Why? Because it shows intent. Intent. That word again. Rachel placed the phone back on the desk. Most cases like this are difficult because it's hard to prove someone meant to cause harm. Your father appears to have admitted it. I sat quietly for a moment. What does that mean for me? Rachel folded her hands on the desk. It means you have options. For the past 3 years that word had barely existed in my life. Options. Rachel continued. We can start with a cease and desist order. That would legally require him to stop contacting employers. I nodded slowly. And if he doesn't? Then the next step is litigation. Litigation. Another heavy word. She opened the folder again. With documentation like this, you could pursue a civil case for damages. How serious are we talking? Rachel didn't hesitate. Very serious. She pointed to the list of companies. Each of these incidents represents potential financial harm, lost income, career damage, emotional distress. 32 companies. 32 opportunities erased. Rachel looked at me carefully. But before any of that happens, there's usually one step first. What step? Your father will be notified. I already knew how that conversation would go. He would deny everything. Or worse, he would justify it. Rachel closed the folder and slid it back toward me. I want you to think carefully about something, she said. What's that? People who behave like this often believe they are protecting something. Family reputation. Control. Tradition. That sounded exactly like my father. But when they realize their actions have legal consequences, she continued, their perspective changes quickly. I left the office about an hour later. The folder was back in my backpack. But something about the weight felt different now. Before, the documents had felt like proof of something painful. Now they felt like protection. My phone buzzed again while I was walking back to my car. Another message from my father. I already knew what it would look like. Another reminder. Another attempt to push me back home. I opened the message. You're running out of time. I stared at the words for a moment. Then another message arrived. You can't survive out there forever. For years. Those words would have shaken me. But now they felt strangely distant. Because my father was still playing the same game. The only problem was, the rules had changed. I placed the phone back in my pocket and got into my car. For 3 years, my father believed he was slowly forcing me back under his control. What he didn't know yet was that very soon he was going to receive a letter of his own. And unlike the messages he kept sending me, this one would come from a law office. And it would make one thing very clear. The calls were over. The accusations were over. And if he tried it again, the consequences would no longer be private. They would be public. 3 days later, my father received the letter. I didn't send it myself. Rachel did. It arrived by certified mail at his office in our hometown, addressed directly to him, with the law firm's name printed clearly across the top. Inside the envelope were several things. A formal cease and desist notice. Copies of the documented emails he had sent to employers. Phone call transcripts from companies he had contacted. And a clear legal warning explaining that if the interference continued, a civil case would follow. Rachel had worded the letter carefully. Professional. Direct. Impossible to misunderstand. I didn't hear anything that first day. Or the second. Which didn't surprise me. My father had always believed silence was a form of control. But on the third morning my phone rang. His name appeared on the screen. For a moment I just stared at it. For 3 years I had waited for conversations with him to go differently. For 3 years I had hoped something would change. Now something finally had. I answered. Hello. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Then my father spoke. What is this? His voice sounded different than usual. Not angry. Confused. Almost cautious. You received the letter, I said. Yes, he replied slowly. You had a lawyer send this to me? I did. Another pause. Then he said something that sounded almost defensive. I was trying to help you. That sentence didn't surprise me. My grandmother had predicted it years earlier. My father didn't believe he had done anything wrong. He believed he had been correcting my mistakes. You told 32 companies I had a criminal record. I said calmly. You ruined 3 years of my life. His response came quickly. You were making a mistake. There were other ways to handle that. You refused to listen. I leaned back slightly in my chair. For the first time during a conversation with him, I didn't feel the need to argue. I already knew the truth. And more importantly, I had the proof. The calls stop now, I said. Another pause. Then he asked a question I didn't expect. Is that what you really want? I thought about that for a moment. 3 years ago I would have answered differently. 3 years ago I wanted his approval. His respect. Maybe even his understanding. But after everything that had happened, those things didn't matter anymore. What I want, I said slowly, is my life back. The silence that followed lasted several seconds. Then my father spoke again. Quieter this time. You're serious about this? Yes. Another pause. Then he said something I had never heard him say before. Fine. Just one word. But the tone was different. Less certain. Less confident. Like someone realizing the situation had changed. The call ended shortly after that. He didn't apologize. I didn't expect him to. But something important had happened during that conversation. For the first time in my life, my father no longer controlled the outcome. The following weeks were strangely calm. No more messages. No more calls from unknown companies. No more rejection emails arriving hours after interviews. Just silence. The kind of silence that happens when someone finally realizes the game is over. About a month later, something else happened. One of the companies on Linda's list contacted me. Melissa's company. The same hiring manager who had replied to my email weeks earlier. Her message was simple. We recently learned new information about what happened during your previous application. If you're still interested, we would like to invite you to interview again. I read the message twice. Then a third time. Not because I doubted it, but because it felt like the first real opportunity one had received in years. The interview happened 2 weeks later. It was straightforward, professional, normal. No strange pauses. No background accusations. Just a conversation about work. About skills. About the future. 2 days later they called. And for the first time in 3 years the call ended with something different. An offer. Wasn't the most glamorous job in the world. But that didn't matter. Because the job itself wasn't the real victory. The real victory was something much simpler. Freedom. The chance to build a life that belonged to me. A few weeks after I started working there, I visited my grandmother's grave. The cemetery was quiet that afternoon. Wind moved softly through the trees. I placed a small bouquet of flowers beside the stone. Then I sat there for a while, thinking about the letter she had written, thinking about the box she had prepared years before any of this happened. She had seen something I hadn't. She understood my father in a way I didn't yet. And because of that, she made sure that when things got bad enough, I wouldn't be alone. Before leaving, I placed my hand gently against the cool stone. Thank you, I said quietly. Then I stood up and walked back toward my car. For most of my life, I believed family meant loyalty no matter what. But my grandmother taught me something different. Sometimes family means protecting someone, even from the people closest to them. And sometimes the bravest thing you can do is simply choose your own life.